Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I want to share with you a recording of a recent AOP Live webinar in partnership with Vendr. The title of the webinar was Stop Shadow Spend in Its Tracks with Improved Data Visibility. And I was joined by my AOP partner, Kelly Barner, along with Emily Campbell, the Director of Product Design and Research at Vendr, and Nick Pinkman, Senior Cloud Manager also at Vendr. Now, our conversation focused on the challenges that procurement teams face in driving cost savings in their SaaS spend, how to start bringing more SaaS spend into procurement's purview, and then some tips in maximizing value for money once we get to the negotiating table. Well, I started by asking Emily if she found procurement or if procurement found her.
A little bit of both. I think you probably could say I found procurement from a little bit of a sort of roundabout way. So I lead product design and product teams, and I've seen firsthand the way that product teams have gotten really good at identifying unmet needs in the market and building software to meet those needs. I've seen firsthand how sales and marketing teams have been innovated to deliver those pieces of software to the end user. But the other side of the market is where I've often found there's still a lot of room to grow and transform, and that's in the IT and procurement space. And I tell my teams, we might build a great solution, but you can't hit a hole in the one without building the green first. And so it's really built this passion of mine to understand what's happening inside of the enterprise, what's happening inside of the business, and how it's transforming so that we can not just build great software, but make sure that it's deliverable into the operations and the systems of the customers that we're actually building for. So that's where my passion for understanding procurement and IT best practices comes from.
Yeah, and it is interesting, as we look at the procurement landscape, everything is becoming a software purchase, whereas before we would look at all the different categories of spend we have, and it's very much, somebody over here is buying logistics, somebody over here is buying HR. Now everything's software. So it's everyone becomes a software buyer, I think. But as we're going to talk about today, too, it's hard to keep track of all those purchases. Mm-hmm. Nick, let me pose the same question to you. Did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
I think it definitely found me. I work with a ton of different procurement teams, and cloud being as business critical as it is, and a lot of different departments we found working across organizations have an easier time than others, engineering teams, finance, for really getting a control on cloud spend and really understanding it. Procurement teams in particular definitely need a little bit more support and understanding for what's going on. So through working with various organizations, it's been great to work with a lot of different procurement teams. So it definitely found me.
Well, let's kind of go into the conversation, and we're going to start. I'm just bringing onto screen. It's the only slide that I will share today, and it's a poll. We do a poll in advance of an AOP live session just to kind of get the perspectives of the Art of Procurement community. I'm going to read this out in full just for anybody who's listening to this rather than watching this on video. Now, the question that we asked this week was, what is the primary challenge procurement faces when trying to deliver savings on cloud software purchases? And so the answers in order of popularity was poor negotiating leverage was the top answer with 37% of respondents. No centralized tracking was 23% of respondents. The fact that the software itself is embedded in current processes, so it's really difficult to kind of extract an organization from using that, was 23% of responses. And then in fourth place, it was because users are signing up directly with 18% of responses. Now, what's interesting about that is there isn't actually a big range from the top answer to the bottom answer, which shows that all four of those in some way, shape or form are challenges for procurement professionals within our community. But I want to just kick things off. And Emily, I'll ask you first, how do you kind of respond and react to those answers based on what you're saying on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I think that they aren't surprising necessarily. I think what they all show is just how hard it is to react to rapid change. And we have had such rapid change in the expansion of software options, like I said earlier, the way it's being sold and delivered, and also just needing to adapt as an organization to now being bombarded by all these additional options that teams are looking at. And then how do you actually go about and make sure that we get the best deal for our company that meets the needs of our business? So, it definitely points to just the need to adapt fast. And I think particularly in that poor negotiating leverage, just understanding even how do we change our approach to getting those, those great negotiated contracts without full information is really the biggest challenge.
Nick, any reaction from your perspective?
Yeah, pretty similar. Entirely surprised by these results. I think seeing poor negotiation leverage on top makes total sense. It's where I help a lot of other companies today. I think really the reason why it's up there as number one is because naturally when you're going into a negotiation with a cloud provider, you don't really think you have a ton of leverage with these cloud providers. I mean, number one, they're particularly like the biggest companies in the world. It's typically most of your spend, and it's all of, if not most of your, your cloud infrastructure in a high cost center. So you really think like, hey, how am I really going to go about this if I don't have that much leverage? And it's quite an intimidating thing. But all of those things kind of factor into, where does my leverage really lie? But there are some really good strategies we're going to share today that can really help there.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, I know that the polls we run are limited to 4 answers. But there's a lot of other levers that you can pull to reduce cost in software purchases other than negotiating like for like price, day one, price day two. So I'm sure we're going to get into that, but I'm not surprised either by those answers. Now, before we go into some of the questions that I have set up today, I do just want to remind anybody, if you would like to ask any questions, please do pop those in the chat box, and Kelly will keep an eye on those and bring them into the conversation. Okay, so what I want to do first of all, we want to start talking about managing our shadow spend within the SaaS and the cloud environment. And before we get into the nuts and bolts of that conversation, I think it's really important to talk definitions. So Emily, if I could just ask you, how, as we use the word SaaS and cloud today, what do we mean by those two terms?
Yeah, so I see SaaS as a type of cloud computing. You might also have infrastructure as a service if you think about scaling databases and so on, for example, for those of us building software. But SaaS spend is particularly taking what might have previously been a bespoke solution, something that was really built into quite literally the hardware of the business, and instead is more adaptable, easier to scale, easier to change. So it's one of many types of cloud infrastructure we see hitting the business these days.
And let's continue with the definitions before I go into the questions. I'm going to keep this with you, Emily. What do we mean when we talk about shadow spend?
So shadow spend is anything that the business is using, maybe spending money on, that isn't organized, centrally managed by the IT group within the company. So that can include, an employee putting 2 or 3 seats of some new tool on their personal credit card or on an expenditure card. But it also could include things like free trials, or a free account that could eventually grow into something that we're committed to spending money on. And of course, it doesn't just affect expenditures. It affects where data is stored, who has access to that data. Sometimes you end up with conflicting tools that do the same thing. Information can be stored in multiple places. So cost is a part of it, but this issue with shadow IT, shadow spend, manifests in other ways as well.
Yeah, and this category, the category of SaaS, or whether it's specific to cloud within SaaS, is probably become the largest area of shadow spend within procurement organizations, because it's so easy for an end user to make a purchase, and that's often a go-to-market strategy from the software providers. They want to make it easy for an end user to go and do a free trial and to start using it. And then they start using it, and like you say, they put it on their credit card, and you don't really get an idea of multiply that across an enterprise. how often that's going on. So really definitely a problem for procurement folks around this category of spend. Now I have a question for Nick. How can procurement help determine if a company's current mix of SaaS software and the process for going and buying it is actually meeting the company's needs?
Yeah, I think that, shadow spend also definitely exists in the cloud. I mean, similar, you can spin up accounts and instances, and it really is dependent on, your governance strategy as well, like what guardrails are in place to prevent, certain things. But looking back at it, there's kind of a Russian nesting doll in a way of how you can actually buy SaaS even through cloud providers using some of like the GCP or the AWS marketplace, the Microsoft marketplace as well. So there's opportunities to say, hey, we're running this infrastructure and we're using these tools in AWS, for example, and there's other products such as like Datadog that can be pretty easily procured through the marketplace. So it's, kind of expands very quickly when you start to think about it. So the best way to do is to really, try and leverage as many stakeholder conversations. And what we found a lot of large enterprise do is create what's called the Cloud Center of Excellence, which is kind of a steering committee for your cloud business, the direction it's heading, and being sure that everybody's reading off the same sheet of music and you're marching in the right direction.
Who would be the right stakeholders to be in a cloud center of excellence or to invite to be a part of, a governance structure like that?
Yeah, definitely engineering. They're usually the ones hands-on. Any product teams, procurement should definitely be involved, especially when it comes time for some of these larger contract conversations, as well as finance. Finance is very critical for understanding what budgeting approvals look like. But yeah, and it could also go up to even the C level and VP level as well.
Now, do you find that these exist outside? So IT, for example, and groups within IT are already running governance like this that procurement may not necessarily have insight into, or it's something that procurement can actually proactively facilitate to bring different stakeholder groups together?
Wish I had a great answer, but it really depends on the organization. There's also a huge, caveat of how mature the organization is in cloud. Some are just getting started and are focused more on building and speed and pushing out product to customers, and others are more of, how do we maintain the infrastructure that we have? How do we increase cost efficiencies? And how do we be sure that everything's controlled? So I'd say it's pretty rare that people have a lot of foresight in setting all those policies and governance up ahead of time, but you never know.
So if it doesn't exist, then it's a great opportunity for procurement.
Yes, absolutely. And kind of leading the charge, gathering all these stakeholders together.
And the question came, so Caesar asked, and we started to answer that there around best practices for identifying shadow spend. Emily, I just wonder if there's anything from your perspective as you kind of see broadly across a variety of different clients and prospects that you work with at Vendr every day, if there's anything from that consistently stand out or that you're recommending to folks.
Yeah, Nick mentioned procurement maturity, and that's a little bit of a giant topic. But I think the thing I would call out is shadow spend doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be something that actually exposes you to opportunities to improve the services you provide inside of your company to your customers, the people who are doing the work day to day. Certainly, there's a component of education, making sure people are aware of the risk of having these types of distributed spend and distributed usage. And as we become more customer-centered as businesses in general, talking about the ways that compliance risk, for example, can actually create risk for our customers as well as for our company, can make people be more aware about what this type of proliferation of whether it's SaaS or cloud usage can create. But I come from a background of research and product thinking and design, and so where my brain goes and what I see in best practices of teams who are really reaching into these more mature practices is when you find this type of usage, when you find usage at the business unit level or the individual level you didn't know, it's a great chance to ask why. Is it an issue where the tools we're currently set up with just aren't solving the needs of the teams and the people doing the work? Or is it something we can look at in terms of our own services of procurement and IT centralization? Is there an opportunity for us to improve how we communicate with employees inside of the business? So taking that research lens, that perspective to understand, I think is a really great practice that can lead you forward.
It's a really great point what you said. There's a couple of things there. One is that it's not necessarily bad if that you shouldn't be necessarily striving for zero shadow spend, but that where shadow spend exists, and this is kind of a philosophy across all categories, it is because we haven't provided the opportunity for a business user to buy what they need in as easy as most appropriate way as possible. So they're essentially looking at either they haven't even thought about the procurement process because the procurement process has never brought any value to them, or they're looking at how can the procurement process isn't easy enough for me to get what I want, so I'm going to go around it. So I always see that as being a procurement problem as opposed to it being a business problem, because it's up to us to find ways that we can help facilitate them to get the things that they need. Mm-hmm. Kelly, I do want to come over to you just to ask if we've had any questions so far from our audience to pose to either Emily or Nick.
We have had some questions, and actually what I want to start with is a comment. We get comments as well as questions during these events. Saham says, thank you for defining shadow spend and SaaS. I've heard different explanations. In a subject matter like this, terminology is so incredibly important. And that comment actually ties in very closely to a question that we got, which might come down to terminology. Those internal relationships are so key. So if procurement speaks to IT about the challenge of shadow spend, should we expect them to be familiar with what we're talking about? Is it a terminology question? Would this be something they would be monitoring, or would they consider it more of a contract issue? Emily, maybe let me start with you on this question.
I think it'll depend on the business. And, maybe the way of turning this question around is how can we be coming up with a common language no matter who we're talking to? If it's between procurement and IT, that might be a little bit more direct. But even thinking about business users, how do we make sure that we're not just using procurement ease when we're talking to folks, but we're actually talking about the real problem or the real opportunity? How can we get you the tools you need? What are our gaps right now? What's standing in the way of you adopting what we've already procured for the business, or even knowing how to ask questions about what is available or how we can evolve our process? And the thing about terminology is, as soon as those words mean different things, it can create pretty quick miscommunication and misalignment that can lead to other issues downstream. So I love this frame of question, and always lead from what do we mean with the words, and actually what are we trying to achieve together? That's really where I think we should focus.
Yeah. Nick, anything that you wanted to add in on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think related to cloud, shadow spend can be tied very similarly to like cost optimization efforts. There's a lot of different things that fall under that umbrella. So maybe not calling that when it comes to, the cloud or like AWS initiatives in particular, but so many companies face challenges of, how do we make sure that we're getting the most bang for the buck? The resources that we have deployed, are they sized appropriately? Are we getting the best discount possible? And so those are all common themes that every customer should, have on their radar. But I think just framing it more like that when it comes to cloud is definitely something that, is very common.
Well, and one of the things that I already hear both of you saying, Emily, you came right out of the gate and said shadow spend doesn't have to be bad. But even in the language that we're using to speak, whether it's to IT, whether it's to finance, whether it's to distributed users, I'm not hearing a lot of like compliance terminology. We would talk about maverick spend or rogue spend, where procurement is sort of coming in an enforcement capacity. I don't think that's anybody's favorite way to approach the business. So it sounds like what you're both saying is these are big challenges that certainly go beyond procurement, that we all have to work together to address them. But it's not about stamping it out. It's about looking at it as a symptom of an opportunity for procurement to better support what the business needs.
Yeah, and what I see is that the first time that a business user, a line level employee, or even a department lead, the first time they might come across some of these constraints is by being told, no, we can't buy that. We already have something else. You have to use something else. And that creates frustration. And when it's easy to find a roundabout way to get what you need, then people are going to find it. We do see that. And so I think the opportunity here is to frame it from a perspective of how are we serving our customers? How are we maintaining security for all of us? How are we helping with knowledge management, information management, financial management, and scalability? Maybe we can get you that tool that you really want to use if we know who's using it, why it's necessary, and of course, making sure we're doing our diligence around compliance and security. So I think framing this and seeing those employees who are bringing this in as partners to improving the business operations and improving what we're actually trying to do for our customers ultimately brings people in as partners, and it helps folks understand why these are so important in the first place.
Absolutely. So I do have a couple of other questions that have come in, but I'm going to hold them because I think they align very naturally with some of the things that I know we're going to talk about. So Phil, let me pass back to you, and then I will go check in and see what's come in since we've been talking.
All right. Thank you very much, Kelly. And thanks. Keep those questions coming for everybody who is watching us. So we've talked about just kind of a last question on the shadow spend topic. Nick, I'm going to pose this to you. We've said that it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we want to have we don't want it to be prevalent across an organization of people buying whatever they want. What kind of independence do companies kind of allow to say, this is okay for you to go and buy on your own? Once you get to a certain point, we really need to be bringing in, whether it's procurement or coming into some kind of governance process. Do you see any hard and fast rules for those that are the leaders in terms of how they're managing their SaaS and their cloud spend?
Yeah, I'd say when it comes to deploying infrastructure in the cloud, there's usually two customers that fall into one of these two buckets. One is which they give a lot of their developers the autonomy to go deploy to, again, these are the customers that are building fast, pushing out product, making sure everything works, that are doing all these deployments. Then there's others that have more of this, guardrail governance policy that are, want to be sure not only are things being rolled out quickly, developers have what they need to get the job done, but they're also doing it in a way that's cost conscious. So that's kind of one part that I see. The other where I see procurement really coming in a lot is when there are solutions that a customer does need. Like I mentioned, like maybe procuring Datadog through the marketplace as an example, or New Relic or Snowflake, all of these cloud connected products that are becoming very, very popular. Typically when these, contracts need to be done and they're getting pointed to the marketplace, like, oh, we can easily procure it there. That's typically where we see procurement getting like very heavily involved in these cloud conversations, because they're treated as kind of different and separate contracts, and it's not as easy, to deploy. So when it comes to anything that kind of touches cloud and the actual AWS or Google Cloud spend, that's where we see procurement getting heavily involved.
And I do want to, in a few moments, I'm going to pivot towards talking about the specifics around cloud negotiations. But I do want to talk just for a couple more questions more broadly around, how can procurement kind of, control is the wrong word. I hate the word control because that suggests that we're trying to do something that takes something away from the business, but get more influence and build more repeatable, scalable processes around the management of cloud and SaaS spend. Well, one of the questions that I wanted to ask was, how do we do this in a way? How do we get our hands around this spend in partnership with IT? And Emily, I'll ask this to you, in partnership with the IT folks, without them running a mile in the other direction to say, here comes procurement, they're going to tell me what to do.
So I've sort of hit on involving people from the start. And I think that's really the important thing here is removing the iron curtain, being transparent about our policies, our processes, and also our decision making. There's been a growth of workflow tools. It's something we're working on at Vendr as well. That's one possible way of helping to give more transparency to the process. So that's where I'd start, making sure that people understanding the framework of what are the gates we have to pass through? How can you make a case early on? How can you help negotiate at the decision level? And basically, work with us, work with procurement to do this together. So that's, from the procurement end tools that we can use. Other things that I've seen companies start to explore is things like using our budget not so much as a like kingmaker, you can have a budget, you can't, but rather seeing the way that we budget our finances as an unlocking of innovation within the business, almost thinking like a venture capital group. What are we trying to do with this money, with this tool, with this infrastructure? How are we going to know if we were successful? And what is the scale that we need in order to get to that first milestone where we can say, was this the right investment? Should we be investing more? So that's another tactic that I see teams start to adopt. Again, looking at some of those more mature practices, but drawing from what's already happening inside of the business. We're used to the idea of thinking about planning ahead, OKRs, KPIs. How can we adopt that into our business infrastructure, our financial and IT management, and not, just leaving that for the product teams to think about that holistically.
And other those conversations, like, do those happen at the CPO to CIO level? Do they happen at the buyer to engineer level? Like, where are the connections formed that typically allow procurement the opportunity to help manage this spend?
Well, I think it will depend on the sort of the culture of the company and the type of work the company is in. Obviously, if you're handling a lot of data, if security is a major component of what it is that you do, you might have different policies. But I think the most important thing is developing a strong kind of operating agreement about how we're going to conduct procurement, how we're going to measure the success of our investments at the tool and the infrastructure level, and then making sure that department heads, people at the VP level are aligned and in agreement to that policy. And that way, where you do have employees or different groups within the business purchasing tools, maybe on a free trial, maybe at a small level, everyone's aware about what happens next if we want to grow that within the business, and also what the trade-offs are of taking those steps to kind of go around those central processes. So discussion, conversation, not criminalizing shadow spend, but rather, bringing people in and really focusing on where we do need to have more control for security reasons or for financial reasons. That type of constant conversation is the way to create the healthiest dialogue and the best outcomes.
Yeah, from a procurement perspective, this is where innovation happens. It's where business model innovation happens, when the business stakeholders are looking at using new technology to either change the way they work or to help them with challenges that they've had or take advantage of opportunities. So it's interesting that a lot of time we look at innovation as being, let's focus on those top 80, the top 80% spend of suppliers, not the bottom 20, where some of these SaaS companies will be coming in and where we're starting to engage with them. For me, it's a really big opportunity from an innovation perspective to be more involved, but more involved in a consultative perspective than with a big stick to say, hey, you can't go and do that, because then they're not going to work with you. But one of the things that you talked about was workflows. And so I'm just really interested to know, like, how, because this is, thinking differently about how you buy spend, any spend, whether it's cloud, SaaS spend, or anything else. How are you thinking about the application of workflows to a buying process?
So one of the benefits of a workflow tool or framework is it forces you to think through those decisions early on, right? So it's not, I make a request, it goes into a black box, and then I get a yes or no back. But it actually forces some degree of transparency right from the start. So that's one benefit. Another thing that goes alongside with workflows is thinking about, well, where is that data coming from that's going into the data tool? Do we even understand all of the, who we should be talking to, who should have visibility into what? And so, workflows are a way of giving transparency into the decision-making, the data that's changing, the contract decision-making, and so on inside of the business. But anything that we put into place, a workflow, a operating agreement, a set of principles, a set of rules, that's always tied to some philosophy, some culture, some way that the business has decided to make decisions. And so I'd say that's the place to start. How do we want to make decisions? And then what tool is the best way to enforce that and bring our partners in, give them transparency, and actually get the outcomes that we're trying to get to.
And so for running a workflow in a tool like Vendr, for example, would that be something where it's kind of a standalone experience, or is it integrated into some of the other technology stack that an organization may have, but it's specific to buying, SaaS and cloud purchases, so it's built, with that in mind?
Yeah, so in Vendr's case, we have your underlying system of record where you store all of your contract data about who's associated with which groups inside of the business. We also collect transactional spend so we can see the delta between what I'm contracted for and then what's actually showing up on my credit cards and my banking statements. So we're able to, kind of give you that full look into not just what's happening during the procurement process, but the current state. And then, thinking about, well, what does that mean once this contract is signed? And so that's, I think, an example of how workflows themselves are a technology. But having that centralized data, having people feel comfortable pulling all their data in one place and also giving you the tools so it's not a very manual process, as well as the decision making of what should the design of this workflow be, who is making what decisions when and in what order, is a critical part of the success of deploying that technology inside of the business.
And Kelly, I do want to come back before I start going into the into details on actual cloud software negotiations. I'd love to come back to you, see if we've got any more questions that you would like to share.
Sure, I do have one. And Nick, I'll tell you in advance, I'm going to start with you here. But let me read this question in. I think you've impressed everybody, both of you, with all of your expertise. And so the question that naturally arises is, should procurement dedicate one or more team members to cloud, SaaS spend, supplier management, based on the level of expertise required to succeed? So we have teams running more process-driven, generalist-focused, who has the bandwidth to take on a project. Other teams are more category-focused. Nick, any advice or things that you've seen work or not work, the way the procurement team is actually divided around needing to stay involved with this spend and these relationships?
Yeah, I can kind of speak to some of the experience I've seen since working here at Vendr. I'd say that we are really plugged into a lot of our customers' procurement processes. However, when it comes to cloud infrastructure and these large contract negotiations, given the high level of importance, and most of these are like I said, the number one spend item for all of our customers, we see a lot of heads of procurement being very hands-on in these. Again, that may just be because given the importance of the contract, but I do think it does make sense for someone to, when these contracts are coming up, to be dedicated to having that voice of the procurement team as a part of this process. Reason being is these cloud negotiations are very lengthy, and being able to have someone from the procurement team be a representative throughout is critically important. Like I said, it does take a lot of different stakeholders, so having someone from procurement be there will ensure the process goes smooth, that contract looks great when it comes over and everything like that. So when it comes time to the actual contract negotiation, I'd say it's absolutely something that you should do, but during the term, it will kind of vary the level of hands-on that you want to have related to the cloud spend itself.
And you mentioned some of these providers being exceptionally large, in many cases, in fact, the largest suppliers these companies are working with. Should we also adjust our relationship expectations, based on the relative size between these companies we're trying to negotiate with and the footprint associated with the spend of our own organization?
I would say maybe treat it more of a partnership conversation, because what I have seen, especially with my background working with AWS so much, is they don't laugh me out of the room for saying this, but they are somewhat incentivized to help save their customers money. They know that if they want a strong, long-term, customer-obsessed relationship, that they're going to need to help you be confident in the decisions that you're making sure that the organization feels good about where they're at and where they're going. And when it comes time to do these contract negotiations, it's the perfect time to bring everybody together and have that conversation. So I'd say more of taking that partnership level approach, but also being very clear with what you want as well.
Sure. And Emily, I see you smiling and nodding. Are you in agreement around sort of the expertise or the category dedication in this area? And then, of course, any thoughts you wanted to add around the nature of these relationships?
The market is getting more complicated. It's getting more nuanced. And so having people who really can understand at a deep level why, to negotiate in one way versus another based off of what it is you're trying to procure, I think category expertise is so critical. And I absolutely agree with Nick. Seeing opportunities to build partnership between, procurement on your end and whoever it is you're working on the other side. The incentives and the dynamics in any market right now are really evolving towards service-oriented, create value, think about the long term. And I'm not surprised we're seeing that with some of the larger providers as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you both very much. Phil, I'll pass it back to you.
All right, thank you. And I've made a couple of follow-on questions that I want to ask in a moment specific to negotiations, because I want to go a little bit deeper into that. But the first question that I wanted to ask, when we think about starting to prepare for cloud software negotiations, and Nick, I will pose this to you, is that it's really important to have data in any negotiation, to be able to make fact-based arguments and points as opposed to just kind of coming up with something that's subjective, or that's I feel this or I think this, which can be very easily pushed back on by a provider when you're in those negotiations. Do you have any tips or advice around how to actually get your hands around the data that you need to then effectively plan a negotiation with a cloud provider?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think that the work that goes into these successful negotiations with these cloud providers, I'd say go as far to say at least 70% is all in preparation. There's a lot of different sources of truth. I don't know if anybody's gotten their hands on an AWS invoice recently, but it can be over 50 pages long. It calls out everything in extreme detail. A lot of people find that valuable, but to folks like myself, it can get pretty hard to decipher and kind of figure out where all the costs are going. It's hard not to go a little technical in answering this question, but what I will suggest is leveraging, your technical teams that you do have to get granted read-only access to the billing console and the billing features. In there, there's a lot of native tools that will allow you to kind of understand where costs are, more importantly, where they're trending, so that you can have more visibility into them. Some other customers go as far as to have third-party tooling installed. There's a huge optimization industry, like I mentioned before. A lot of them play into how can we get visibility across the organization so that people can make more educated decisions. But there's truthfully a lot of native tooling within the consoles for these cloud providers to really start looking at it. But from there, I'd say kind of leverage those tools as you can, partner with your technical teams to be sure that you have the complete picture of where the spend is and where it's going.
And Emily, do you have anything from your experience, anything to add to Nick's perspective?
Not specific to cloud, but I think even for SaaS in general, I would recommend similar thinking. Bring your partners in, the experts inside of the business, understand how things are being used, how costs have scaled. With regards to SaaS, you're seeing an innovation from the sales and marketing side of the product-led growth per seat pricing. Somebody throws a document out there and suddenly you have 15 more paid seats on a contract that you didn't even know you were spending. And so the more that we can understand how tools are being used or could be used inside of the business and how they're growing, why they're growing, is it intentional or not, the more prepared you're going to be for those negotiations when you go into them.
Yeah. And Nick, do you see that the opportunity for managing cost in this space is as much demand management than it is cost pricing negotiations?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of internally, like competing for internal resources, time as well. Like I mentioned, it's kind of competing priorities in a sense, because you'll have your technical team wanting to push out new updates, release new features to new products to get those in the hands of your customers quicker. Oftentimes, taking a look at the bill kind of comes secondary, unless there's a very strategic push by the organization across different groups and stakeholders to get that alignment, that buy-in, and to prioritize that. So definitely.
It's kind of interesting that you've got to make it a priority or figure out a way to make it a priority for your internal organization before you can even go after this. And I'm sure that in some regards, there's this fear of, my entire business is reliant on AWS as an example. Let's not poke the bear because we're kind of happy with how things are going right now. And if we have to pay some more, that's okay because we're going to make it up over here. Do you come across that often?
I would say yes. I'd say there always hits a point where someone gets an invoice that raises a red flag. I've seen it across nearly every organization I've worked with. I think it's, hey, we're starting to spend, everything's going good, and then it's like, well, $100,000 this month. Where did that come from? And then it starts going, we release these new products, these new updates, and things like that. And so I think it naturally does kind of pop up at some point based on the level of spend and how much you are spending. But it really just varies by customer.
Mm-hmm. And Steve in advance asked some questions around effective strategies and best practices, and we're kind of picking some of those apart right now. What I thought I'd do is kind of reframe this this question to be: are there any common misconceptions that you see when you're going into a cloud negotiation where there's an assumption perhaps on your client side, or just general procurement perceptions around what they believe to be true going into a negotiation with a large cloud provider versus what the reality is?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you, Steve, for asking that one in advance. I'd say the misconception is that you're going to get the same level of SaaS discounts as you will on your cloud bill. Very often that's not the case. And so going into that expecting these large volume discounts across all of your cloud spend often is relatively unachievable depending on your level of spend. I know there's a lot of it depends, but that one, and I kind of touched on it before, but kind of thinking that, you don't have any leverage. There are a lot of ways in which you can go about doing this. And I think that kind of does bring up some of the best practices to look out for. I think, the first one I brought up earlier, which cannot be stressed enough, is engage stakeholders across your organization. Like, these negotiations are long time. They have a very long runway and they're very time consuming. Having, the buy-in from finance on the numbers, knowing the technical side from the engineering teams, and you being there as the procurement leads to, be sure that all the contracts go smoothly and that everybody's on the same page is going to be huge for getting anything across the line. Secondly, I'd say the biggest misconception is that, you can just kind of say, oh, we spend millions, we're a huge customer. A lot of these cloud providers have a ton of million-dollar customers. You might think that you're a huge fish in this space, when in reality, I've seen them say no to a ton of customers. And that's not because they're unwilling to work with them, but it's because expectations have been off. And I'd say the best way to combat that is to come in your own projections. A lot of these cloud providers will be looking at what they have access to. What they don't know is what your plans are, what your stories are, and what the data is telling you, and where you plan on taking your organization over the next few years. And so I would say coming with those data, being very data oriented in these conversations, and having that story of like where the spend actually will end up in an ideal world is the ideal way to do it.
And another follow-up question that I just noted as you were speaking earlier is, you talked, I think a few questions ago, about the fact that these negotiations can be rather lengthy in duration. I wonder is there any kind of typical rhythm to a negotiation with a cloud provider, or is it just really, situational?
Yeah, I'd say when things fall out of what I would consider like the norm, they have a particular criteria for what would be easily approved, and to go through that can make it a 2 or 3 week process. I'd say very often they don't do that. So the level of approvals that it does take to kind of get things that are more bespoke and like what you're asking for approved, if it's a particular case, they can take a large amount of time. So I always recommend being 2 to 3 months out before you start really, engaging your cloud provider. Especially if it's a renewal and you're backing up against a date where you could potentially lose a large discount. Even a few percents on a couple million a month is quite huge. And so that's what I would really suggest, is get out in front of it as much as you can. But approval processes with these cloud providers do take a while. And I think part of that is because they're such large companies.
Yeah. Now, in some way it's cliche, but I think it is so because certainly in certain circumstances it's borne out as being fact. But do you see the negotiating and giving decisions at end of quarter, end of fiscal years, that's still an effective way of sealing the deal, so to speak?
I don't think it has as much of an impact as it does like with other SaaS suppliers. A lot of companies are like kind of an it depends. I think obviously, every sales rep that you work with at either a SaaS company or a cloud provider has a number they want to hit. And so it is important that they get these deals in by the end of quarter, end of month. But at the end of the day, most of them are willing to work on your timeline, as long as you're very clear and transparent for when you need that. I think with renewals, it's a little bit more straightforward, because if you do have a renewal coming up, getting that new discount locked in before you forfeit it is really important. But I'd say definitely end of year does have somewhat of an impact, but maybe not as much as other suppliers.
Thanks, Nick. And Kelly, I want to come back to you. Any more questions that we've received from the audience today?
Yes, and in fact, we have a good one that really brings us sort of full circle. So we started talking about the data from that LinkedIn Snap poll where procurement was concerned about the lack of leverage leading into these negotiations. And so Helen asks, is the cost of, and of course, risk from change still a factor that's considered as a barrier to changing suppliers? So if we think about maybe the most straightforward leverage as being, I have alternatives, I can walk away, and yet switching costs and switching from one provider to another makes everybody nervous. Emily, maybe let me start with you on this one. What are your thoughts around walking away, changing out suppliers as being effective negotiating leverage?
Gosh, that's a great question. I think the way that I'd frame this is there's always an opportunity cost to using that type of a lever. So knowing what that would mean if you're ready to call that bluff is going to be critical. But we're also seeing that on the SaaS level, there is a lot of conformity in the market. It's not so much about changing, just making the change from one to another. You have to think about, do people know where our data is? Are we ready to do the knowledge management of actually moving things, from A to B? And what I've seen is that many suppliers, they'll respond well to those sorts of concerns because it's often not so much a product concern of comparing A versus B. It's, am I getting the service that I need? How can we improve it? Where can we go? And they want to negotiate with you. They want to help you find the right deal to help you stay. I'm actually going to put to Nick in terms of the negotiating strategy there. But I just say, along with everything we've been talking about, it's the operational cost that often is the barrier to finding knowledge, making change, thinking about scaling something into the future, and of course, avoiding folks going around what you're already doing as a business. So that's a great question. And I think it really just sort of depends on the risk level of the business and what it is you're trying to accomplish. That's a tough one.
Yeah, I completely agree on the operational aspect of it. I think these cloud providers, like, again, looking through my cloud lens over here, it's incredibly difficult to transition all of your infrastructure from one, cloud provider to the other. And they do know that. What I will say is, don't look at it as like the whole pie, but slices of the pie. Like, competition for workloads is definitely a big motivator. Like all of them, whether it be GCP, Microsoft, AWS, obviously they want all of your business. And if, you do have better options for, let's say you have a more data intensive workload that might run better for some reason on GCP, there's your competition lever there. I would say that the disadvantage there is, if you pool all your pricing together, you're obviously going to get the better discount. But again, it does become an operational cost, like just kind of hovering over, oh, we can just move all this somewhere else, may not hold as much water in the cloud versus, switching, a SaaS tool for maybe their next best competitor.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for your answers on that.
And so, Nick, I have a follow-up actually, which is if you were designing a supplier strategy from the beginning, from a cloud perspective, would you be recommending you have a multi-supplier strategy or a single source strategy?
I'm always of the mindset of whichever technology supports, your product and your business the most is the one that should be. Again, that's kind of going back to more of like the technical side of my brain and how I think. But when it comes to like, we're trying to get the best price ever, I think consolidating your spend, especially if, you have it all under like one master account, like whether it be with AWS, like that's leveraging all that spend together will benefit you in getting the best discount. I would say like kind of putting together my strategy, like I think like really think about other things that you're looking for. There's oftentimes a lot of customers just don't know what to ask for. And by, again, taking that partnership view, saying, hey, here's some of the projects we have coming up on our roadmap. We really kind of maybe need some help here. What options exist? We'll definitely kind of put in some good faith and have more of a partner-oriented conversation. And oftentimes, like I mentioned, these cloud providers are pretty great to work with. Mm-hmm. You'd be surprised and are able to provide some benefits you may not have thought they'd be able to.
So there's not necessarily a simple answer, but it's it's aligning with the needs of the business, what makes sense from a technical perspective, as much of we should make sure that we're using 3 different providers, even if it's 80-10-10, so that we have some competition in the marketplace. That's not necessarily where that may be a standard or a go-to kind of procurement strategy. That might not actually be what's best for the business, depending on the technical nature of what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. And in our experience, we've worked with customers that are all in on a particular, cloud vendor, and we have others that want to have, they're pushing their product through AWS, but they also want to give their customers the option to do it in other cloud providers. So it's also, what are your customers looking for as well? But absolutely.
All right, so it's nearly time to start wrapping up. I've got 2 more questions that I want to pose. So thanks for your patience as I'm throwing these negotiation questions at you, Nick. We had a question that came in from Joey, and Joey asked, is it a different negotiation model to buy software as a service via a usage license versus a platform which could be consumed in a variety of ways, not always a user, not always a standard license? Like, how do you look at the differences between those kind of models?
Yeah, very good question. And they are very different. It's not necessarily a one-to-one. We have these many users, so we need these many seats. It's really much more of like a capacity and like how your business is growing. And oftentimes that's the hardest component, is how do we forecast? It's a big area when I work with FP&A teams as well, is like, how do we really know how much we're going to grow? And to a large extent, it could possibly be somewhat of a guess. But what I will say is, like, cloud contracts are often made up of 2 main aspects. The first one is the annual spend commitment. So how much are you spending on this infrastructure year over year? And then a term length. So that's really the main thing, is like, all these cloud contracts have, a longer time to close. And that's because it's so important to nail down those annual commitments and really see, by bringing in all these stakeholders, how do we know where our spend is going to be and get that accurate forecast ahead of time? That's usually the most time consuming part, but it's the most important. And that's also the main differentiator in cloud contracts versus SaaS agreements.
Okay. And so I have one last question, Emily. I'm going to pose this to you first, and then let Nick jump in afterwards. And it's around, like, how do we measure success? So I'm interested to know, from what you see, are there any metrics that you see, organizations use to measure the impact of procurement that goes beyond, we saved you 5% on this deal, that's not necessarily a cost saving lever? Because I think we're always trying to figure out, how can we demonstrate value of being involved in the process? That doesn't necessarily mean, going and trying to beat up a supplier for a couple of percentage points, especially in an area like this, where the impact of that software is more important than going and saving a couple of percentage points.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly tracking cost savings, tracking time savings, how quickly are we able to negotiate a deal that we all feel is acceptable, are, your first and foremost KPIs. But other things that you might look at, we've been talking a lot about, improving the maturity of the operations within a business, building partnership with stakeholders. What is the general satisfaction with procurement? What percentage of software seats, or, in the case of cloud infrastructure spend dollars, are being negotiating through procurement versus being caught after the fact and then having to be collected? Can we even look across, once we do identify shadow spend, and this comes with destigmatizing or decriminalizing it inside of the business, even just looking at, when we identify it, how many different instances can we find? Do we even see concentration of shadow adoption, or groups talking to themselves and pooling opportunity and then coming and presenting that business case to procurement? So those are some of the more lagging indicators. And then, of course, also looking at those changes over time. So not just at the dollar level, how much did we save based off of projected spend this month or this quarter, but how does that compare to a quarter ago or a year ago? Are we getting better? Are we building stronger relationships? Are we being savvier with our projections and our business case generation? And then ultimately, are we able to negotiate better deals as a result of that strength and coordination on our end when we're actually talking to the supplier?
Thanks, Emily. There's a lot of different ways for us to measure that, which is great, because you always want to try and find some of those non-cost savings measures. Time is an important one. You said that right at the top. I've seen organizations measure how much time is saved by highly paid engineers not having to get in the weeds of negotiating or being involved in contracting because, scarce resources, expensive resources, you want them doing what they're paid to do as opposed to getting involved in procurement processes. Nick, I want to just throw that over to you for one last minute. If there's anything else from your perspective when you're looking specifically at cloud that we should be thinking about as, impact measures, let's say, for procurement.
Yeah, I think everything Emily just mentioned also applies very well to cloud. I would say when you do have a large cloud negotiation that comes up, it brings all these people together and it's a great way to hash out what are our challenges, what are some things we want to improve on, and leveraging that as a forum to then build upon and have operational improvements is a huge indicator that this has been successful. I think it's also one of those great ways where procurement can get very involved and to make a large impact is by really leading that charge. And so by creating efficiencies, going through, hey, we think we need to optimize this level of spend. How do we do that? And being able to then track those projects, hey, we've installed these guardrails, things are improving, our spend is getting cleaner, and we now know that we have the confidence that our organic growth is tied to, our customer growth and our product growth. That's a great thing and a great place to end up at the end of this.
Well, I know it's time to wrap up. This is an area of spend which is really has the potential for procurement to play a really leading role and a very strategic role, breaking down those barriers with IT and being able to demonstrate that what we can do to help the business grow as opposed to it just being cost, but cost management then kind of flows as just a consequence of really helping the business be more focused in how they are purchasing their cloud and their SaaS spend. So Emily and Nick, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Cheers.
And I want to thank everybody for watching. I want to thank you for submitting the questions that you did as we went along the way. We had a lot to talk about today. We almost filled up the full hour and we could have gone on for more, I'm sure. Kelly, thanks for being the eyes and the ears of the audience.
Absolutely. And thank you to everybody who submitted those great comments and questions.
All right. Well, that's it for today for another AOP Live. Thanks again for joining us, and we can't wait to see you again soon. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.